Vietnam, a land of breathtaking beauty. Emerald green rice paddies stretch as far as the eye can see. Towering mountains pierce the sky, shrouded in mist. Ancient temples stand as silent sentinels, whispering tales of a rich and troubled past. But beneath this serene facade lies a history scarred by conflict, a history that continues to echo through generations. For centuries, Vietnam fought for independence, first against the Chinese, then against the French. Each battle etched deeper the Vietnamese people's unwavering resolve. Their indomitable spirit fueled a burning desire for freedom, a desire that would erupt on the world stage in the 20th century. From the ashes of World War II, a new conflict emerged, the Cold War, a global chess match between superpowers, and Vietnam, a small nation yearning for unity, became a pawn in this dangerous game. This is the story of how a nation divided became a battleground for one of the most controversial wars in human history. In 1954, the Geneva Accords, Vietnam, temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. A communist north led by the enigmatic Ho Chi Minh, a fledgling south supported by the United States. It was a fragile peace, a temporary solution to a deeply rooted conflict. Two ideologies clashed. Two superpowers, locked in a Cold War standoff, used Vietnam as their battleground. The North determined to reunite their nation under communist rule. The South, struggling to establish a democratic government amidst internal strife and external pressures. Caught in the middle were the Vietnamese people, families torn apart, lives shattered by bombs and bullets. Their homeland, a nation at war with itself. Thousands of miles away, another generation was drawn into the fray. Young American soldiers, many barely old enough to shave, found themselves fighting in a faraway land. Their reasons for being there often unclear. Their enemy, elusive and deadly. The Vietnam War was more than just battles and body counts. It was a human tragedy of epic proportions. It was a war that left an indelible mark on the souls of those who fought in it, and those who were caught in its crossfire. Even today, decades after the fall of Saigon, the echoes of war reverberate, in the memories of veterans haunted by what they saw and did, in the families forever scarred by the loss of loved ones, and in the Vietnamese people who continued to rebuild their lives and their nation. But from the ashes of conflict, hope has emerged. Vietnam, once a symbol of division and destruction, is now a nation on the rise. A nation determined to learn from its past and build a brighter future. This is their story, the untold story of a divided nation. To understand the Vietnam War, we must first journey back in time. Before the bombs and the bloodshed, before the rise of communism and the Cold War, Vietnam was a land under the yoke of colonialism. For nearly a century, France ruled Indochina with an iron fist, exploiting its resources and suppressing any hint of Vietnamese nationalism. The French built opulent cities and grand plantations, but these stood in stark contrast to the poverty endured by many Vietnamese. Education and opportunity were reserved for the elite few, while the masses toiled under a system designed to benefit their colonial masters. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, fueled by economic inequality and a yearning for self-determination. The French, blinded by their own sense of superiority, failed to see the storm brewing on the horizon. They underestimated the Vietnamese people's deep-seated desire for freedom, but change was coming. A new generation of Vietnamese leaders emerged, inspired by communist ideals and determined to break free from colonial rule. Among them was a young revolutionary named Nguyen Ai Quoc, later known to the world as Ho Chi Minh. Section 2. The Rise of Nationalism. Ho Chi Minh, a charismatic and enigmatic figure, became the voice of Vietnamese nationalism. He had witnessed firsthand the injustices of colonialism, traveling the world, and embracing communist ideology as a path to liberation. World War II provided a pivotal moment. With France weakened by Nazi occupation, Japan seized control of Vietnam. The Vietnamese people, already suffering under French rule, endured further hardship and brutality. But amidst the chaos, an opportunity arose. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho Chi Minh seized the moment. Standing before a jubilant crowd in Hanoi, he declared Vietnam's independence, echoing the words of the American Declaration of Independence: "All men are created equal." But the path to independence was a treacherous one. France, unwilling to relinquish its colonial prize, returned with a vengeance, igniting the First Indochina War. Section 3. A Nation Divided. The First Indochina War ended in 1954 with the Geneva Accords, a fragile agreement that temporarily divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The North, under Ho Chi Minh's communist leadership, aimed to reunite the country under a single banner. The South, propped up by the United States, struggled to establish a stable government in the face of internal divisions and communist insurgency. The stage was set for a proxy war, a clash of ideologies fueled by Cold War tensions. The United States, fearing the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia, poured money and military advisors into South Vietnam, determined to prevent the domino from falling. But the South Vietnamese government, plagued by corruption and instability, struggled to win the hearts and minds of its people. The Viet Cong, communist guerrillas operating in the South, gained strength and support, exploiting the government's weaknesses and promising a unified and independent Vietnam. As the situation deteriorated, the United States found itself drawn deeper into the conflict, committing more troops and resources in a desperate attempt to stem the communist tide. Section 4. America's Early Involvement. The early 1960s marked a turning point. President John F. Kennedy, convinced that the fall of South Vietnam would have disastrous consequences for American interests in the region, increased the number of U.S. military advisors in Vietnam. These advisors, initially tasked with training and supporting South Vietnamese forces, soon found themselves engaged in combat operations. The Vietnam War was a different kind of conflict, a guerrilla war fought in dense jungles and rice paddies, where the enemy was often indistinguishable from civilians. The Viet Cong, masters of camouflage and deception, utilized a network of tunnels and booby traps to devastating effect. The United States responded with overwhelming firepower, deploying helicopters, napalm, and Agent Orange in an attempt to decimate the enemy and deny them sanctuary. But the more the United States escalated the war, the more it alienated the very people it was trying to protect. The Vietnam War was becoming a quagmire, a costly and increasingly unpopular conflict that would test the limits of American power and resolve. And as the body count mounted, so too did the questions about the war's purpose and the morality of America's involvement. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict America had fought before. It was a war fought not on open battlefields, but in the suffocating embrace of the jungle, a place where the enemy was invisible, a phantom force that struck with deadly precision and then vanished into the undergrowth. For the American soldier, the jungle was an alien and unforgiving enemy. The stifling heat, the constant threat of booby traps and ambushes, the nagging fear of an enemy that could be anywhere and nowhere. It wore down their resolve, chipped away at their sanity. Every step could be their last. Every shadow could conceal a Viet Cong guerrilla. The jungle was a labyrinth, a living, breathing entity that seemed to conspire with the enemy. They fought in a place where victory was elusive, where the line between friend and foe was blurred, and where the only certainty was the ever-present threat of death. Beneath the jungle floor, a secret war raged. The Viet Cong, masters of guerrilla warfare, had constructed a vast network of tunnels, a subterranean labyrinth that spanned for miles. It was a world of darkness and danger, a testament to their ingenuity and determination. The tunnels were more than just hiding places. They were command centers, hospitals, supply routes, even living quarters. The Viet Cong used them to outmaneuver and outsmart their enemy, striking when and where they were least expected. For the American soldiers tasked with rooting out the enemy, the tunnels were a nightmare. They were forced to enter the darkness, knowing that death could be lurking around every bend. The air was thick with humidity, the stench of decay, and the ever-present fear of the unknown. The tunnels were a testament to the Viet Cong's determination, their resilience, and their intimate knowledge of the battlefield. They were a symbol of the challenges faced by the United States in a war fought against an enemy that refused to fight by conventional rules. The Vietnam War was not just a conflict fought on distant battlefields. It was a war that divided a nation, polarized public opinion, and ignited a global protest movement. In the United States, the war became a deeply divisive issue. As the casualty figures mounted and the conflict dragged on, more and more Americans began to question the war's purpose and the morality of their country's involvement. The war movement gained momentum, fueled by images of carnage and suffering broadcast into American homes every night on the evening news. Students, civil rights activists, artists, and even veterans of the war itself joined the chorus of voices demanding an end to the bloodshed. The Vietnam War had become a moral crisis for the United States, a test of its values and its place in the world. It was a conflict that would leave an indelible mark on American society, shaping its politics, its culture, and its sense of itself for generations to come. Section 4. The Tet Offensive, a turning point. January 1968. The streets of Saigon erupt in chaos. Viet Cong fighters, disguised in civilian clothes, launch surprise attacks on key targets throughout South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy. The Tet Offensive, launched during the Vietnamese New Year holiday, was a military and psychological turning point in the war. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, in a daring and coordinated assault, struck at the heart of South Vietnam, exposing the vulnerabilities of the U.S.-backed government and shattering the illusion of American invincibility. The iconic photograph of General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, South Vietnamese National Police Chief, executing a captured Viet Cong officer in the streets of Saigon. The image, captured by an Associated Press photographer, shocked the world and became a symbol of the war's brutality. Although the Tet Offensive was ultimately a military defeat for the Communists, it dealt a serious blow to American morale and public support for the war. The ferocity of the fighting, the high casualties, and the audacity of the enemy's attacks raised serious doubts about the Johnson administration's claims of progress in the war. A U.S. soldier, his face a mask of exhaustion and trauma, sits hunched over in a trench, the sounds of battle raging around him. The Tet Offensive took a heavy toll on the American military, both physically and psychologically. The Tet Offensive marked a turning point in the Vietnam War, not necessarily in terms of military strategy, but in terms of public opinion. It was a wake-up call for the American people, a stark reminder that victory in Vietnam was far from certain, and that the cost of the war, both in terms of human life and moral standing, was far higher than they had been led to believe. Section 5. The Descent into Chaos. The Tet Offensive marked the beginning of the end for America's involvement in Vietnam. The war, once seen as a noble cause, had descended into a bloody and chaotic quagmire. Public support for the war plummeted, and the anti-war movement gained unprecedented strength and influence. The nation was deeply divided, torn between those who supported the war and those who demanded an end to the bloodshed. Richard Nixon, elected president in 1968 on a platform of peace with honor, implemented a policy of Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing U.S. troops while escalating the bombing campaign against North Vietnam. But the war dragged on, claiming more lives and deepening the divisions within American society. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in 1973, brought a temporary halt to the fighting, but the agreement proved fragile. 2 years later, the North Vietnamese army launched a massive offensive, capturing Saigon and reunifying Vietnam under communist rule. Section 1. A Nation on the Brink. The Tet Offensive had shaken South Vietnam to its core. The enemy was no longer a shadowy force lurking in the jungles, but a visible, determined force capable of striking at the heart of the nation. The streets of Saigon, once bustling with life, now bore the scars of battle. The South Vietnamese army, despite billions of dollars in American aid and training, seemed incapable of halting the communist advance. Morale plummeted, and a sense of despair settled over the once hopeful nation. For ordinary citizens, caught in the crossfire of a war that seemed to have no end, life had become a daily struggle for survival. The constant threat of violence, the shortages of food and medicine, and the loss of loved ones created a climate of fear and uncertainty. The dream of a free and independent South Vietnam seemed to be slipping away, like sand through their fingers. Back in the United States, the Tet Offensive had ignited a firestorm of controversy. The Johnson administration's assurances of progress in Vietnam rang hollow in the face of such fierce fighting and heavy casualties. The American public, once largely supportive of the war effort, began to question the cost of their involvement in this distant conflict. The anti-war movement, fueled by the growing disillusionment with the war, gained momentum. Students, civil rights activists, religious leaders, and even veterans of the conflict joined the chorus of voices demanding an end to the bloodshed. Revelations of atrocities committed by both sides, such as the My Lai massacre, further eroded public support for the war. The image of America, once a beacon of hope and freedom, seemed tarnished by the brutality of the conflict. The Vietnam War had become more than just a military conflict. It had become a deeply divisive issue that threatened to tear American society apart. The Vietnam War exacted a heavy toll on all who were touched by it. For the American soldiers who fought in the jungles and rice paddies, the war was a brutal and dehumanizing experience. They faced not only a determined enemy, but also the challenges of a hostile environment, debilitating diseases, and the constant threat of booby traps and ambushes. Many returned home physically wounded, but even more bore the invisible scars of post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by nightmares, flashbacks, and the guilt of survival. For the Vietnamese people, both North and South, the war was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Millions were killed or wounded, countless villages and towns were destroyed, and the land was poisoned by Agent Orange, leaving a legacy of suffering that continues to this day. The Vietnam War was a tragedy for all involved, a conflict that left deep wounds on the souls of individuals, the fabric of nations, and the conscience of the world. Richard Nixon came to power in 1969, promising to end the Vietnam War with honor. His strategy involved a two-pronged approach: Vietnamization and gradual withdrawal of U.S. forces, coupled with a secret diplomatic offensive to negotiate a settlement. Vietnamization aimed to strengthen the South Vietnamese army and government, enabling them to assume greater responsibility for the war effort. That by gradually reducing the American presence in Vietnam, he could appease the growing anti-war sentiment at home while still preventing a communist victory. Behind the scenes, Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, engaged in secret negotiations with North Vietnamese representatives in Paris. These talks were fraught with difficulties as both sides remained suspicious of the other's intentions. Nixon's strategy, however, was not limited to diplomacy. He authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos, aimed at disrupting North Vietnamese supply lines, a move that drew widespread condemnation for expanding the war and causing civilian casualties. Despite Nixon's efforts to negotiate a peace settlement, the fighting in Vietnam continued. The North Vietnamese Army, sensing American resolve weakening, launched a series of offensives in 1972, testing the South Vietnamese Army's ability to fight on its own. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, brought a temporary halt to the fighting and allowed for the withdrawal of the remaining U.S. combat troops. However, the agreement was fragile, and the underlying issues that had fueled the conflict remained unresolved. America, weary of war and its domestic consequences, had essentially abandoned its South Vietnamese ally, leaving it to face an uncertain future alone. In the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese Army launched a final offensive, sweeping southwards with astonishing speed and ferocity. The South Vietnamese defenses crumbled, and Saigon, the capital, was on the verge of collapse. The fall of Saigon was a chaotic and tragic spectacle. As North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the city on April 30, 1975, panic gripped the remaining Americans and their South Vietnamese allies. At the U.S. Embassy, a frantic evacuation effort was underway, with helicopters ferrying thousands of Americans and Vietnamese to safety aboard waiting ships in the South China Sea. Images of the evacuation, particularly the iconic shot of a helicopter landing on the roof of the U.S. Embassy, became enduring symbols of the chaotic end to America's long and costly involvement in Vietnam. With the fall of Saigon, the Vietnam War came to an end. Vietnam was reunited under communist rule, but the country was devastated, its people deeply divided, and its future uncertain. Part 5 will continue from here. Silence. An unsettling silence descended upon Saigon. The once vibrant city, pulsating with life and energy, was now draped in shadows and uncertainty. The frenzied evacuation, the desperate scramble for freedom, had left a void, a vacuum filled with the ghosts of what once was. The victors, the North Vietnamese Army, had entered a city bearing the scars of war, a city struggling to comprehend its new reality. The South Vietnamese, filled with hope for a democratic future, now faced an uncertain fate under communist rule, and reunification rang hollow for many. Families were torn apart, their loved ones scattered by the winds of war. The dream of a unified Vietnam, a nation healed, seemed a distant and fragile hope. And what of the Americans? They had come to Vietnam with promises of stopping the spread of communism, of defending freedom and democracy. They left, defeated and disillusioned, leaving behind a legacy of shattered promises and unanswered questions. Section 2. A Nation Heals. Time, the great healer, slowly began to mend the wounds of war. The Vietnamese people, known for their resilience and determination, rolled up their sleeves and began the arduous task of rebuilding their shattered nation. From the ashes of conflict emerged a new Vietnam. The communist North and the capitalist South, once locked in a bitter struggle, began the process of integration, a delicate and often challenging dance of ideologies and aspirations. The scars of war remained, etched deep into the landscape and the collective memory of the nation. But there was also a palpable sense of hope, a belief that a brighter future was possible. Vietnam, once a symbol of division and conflict, was slowly transforming itself into a nation on the rise, a nation determined to reclaim its place on the world stage. Yet the ghosts of war continued to haunt Vietnam. Unexploded ordnance, remnants of the massive bombing campaigns, lay hidden beneath the surface, a deadly legacy that claimed lives and limbs decades after the fighting had ceased. Agent Orange, the toxic defoliant sprayed by American forces to deny cover to the enemy, continued to poison the land and its people, causing birth defects and chronic illnesses. And for many veterans, both Vietnamese and American, the war was far from over. They struggled with the physical and psychological wounds of battle, haunted by memories they could not escape. Reconciliation was a long and difficult process, but amidst the pain and the loss, there were glimmers of hope. Former enemies reached across the divide, seeking common ground and understanding. They shared their stories, their pain, and their hopes for a more peaceful future. The Vietnam War was a pivotal event in the 20th century, a conflict that shaped the destinies of nations and left an indelible mark on the global psyche. It was a war that challenged assumptions about American power, exposed the limits of military intervention, and the morality of war. For Vietnam, the war was a defining chapter in its long and turbulent history. It emerged from the conflict a unified nation, but one that bore the scars of division and the weight of unfulfilled dreams. The Vietnam War also had a profound impact on the United States. It divided the nation, eroded trust in government, and sparked a cultural and political awakening that continues to shape American society today. The legacy of the Vietnam War is complex and multifaceted. It is a story of courage and sacrifice, of brutality and loss, of division and reconciliation. It is a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us of the human cost of conflict and the enduring power of hope. Vietnam, a land forever marked by war, yet imbued with an unyielding spirit of resilience. The scars of conflict are still visible, etched deep into the earth and etched even deeper into the memories of its people. The generation that witnessed the horrors of war firsthand carries the weight of history on their shoulders. They remember the bombs, the bullets, the fear that stalked their every step. They remember the loved ones lost, the dreams shattered, the innocence stolen. But they also remember the courage, the sacrifice, the unwavering belief in a brighter future. Today, Vietnam is a nation transformed. The bustling cities, the thriving economy, the vibrant culture, all speak of a people determined to move forward, to embrace the possibilities of a new era. The war, though a painful memory, no longer defines them. A new generation is coming of age, a generation that sees the war through the lens of history books and family stories. They are eager to learn from the past, to build bridges of understanding, and to create a future where peace and cooperation prevail. The legacy of the Vietnam War is complex and enduring. It is a story that continues to challenge and shape our understanding of war, peace, and the human condition. We are left to grapple with the weight of history, to learn from the mistakes that were made, and to honor the sacrifices that were made on all sides. The Vietnam War reminds us that there are no easy answers, no simple solutions to the complex challenges of war and peace. But amidst the sorrow and the loss, there's also a message of hope. The Vietnamese people, who endured unimaginable suffering, have shown the world the true meaning of resilience, forgiveness, and the indomitable spirit of the human heart. The Vietnam War, for all its tragedy and complexity, ultimately reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure, heal, and ultimately triumph. It is a lesson we must never forget.